Welcome to a new edition of the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino. On this episode, we talk with author and seasoned criminal defense attorney James Porfido. He is a certified criminal defense trial attorney as certified by the Supreme Court of New Jersey and the author of the book, Unequal Justice, A Search for Truth to Balance the Scales. His debut book reveals a look inside the courtroom from both sides of the courtroom. He has 35 years of experience as an attorney. He is also a former prosecutor, law professor, and TV legal analyst who has more than 18 years of experience in that area. Over his career, he has offered commentary on many high-profile criminal cases like Harvey Weinstein, Casey Anthony, Scott Petersen, Robert Blake, Phil Spector, and Melanie McQuire, just to name a few. He's got a fascinating outlook on life. Enjoy this interview.
Well, again, man, it's great to meet you. I appreciate you taking a minute out today to talk about your life as an attorney, your book, and everything else in between. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem at all. I'm happy to be on, and thank you for having me on.
Yes, sir. So let's begin our journey into your life by asking you this. You know, surviving COVID was quite a thing going on 5 years ago, and it still has created these waves that we're all dealing with right now. What kind of, reverberations from that time period are you still dealing with in regards to getting through that pandemic period?
Yeah, that's a good question, because really that was probably the point where I decided that I was no longer enjoying the practice of law because of the changes that were happening, that were really prevalent in not just the system in New Jersey, but probably throughout the country, where there were a lot of concessions being made, and it was at the detriment of people accused of crimes, and I felt it was patently unfair, and I experienced it firsthand, representing a number of clients, and it really, the rules seem to have changed dramatically during that period, and some of them have still not been undone. The virtual court things, all that, some of that is still in play, a lot of it. Having your day in court and your ability to confront your accusers and, a speedy trial, all those things were being sacrificed, that I found, from my experience. So I really wasn't enjoying it, and I really didn't feel that the system was, I'll say, being fair to my clients.
So let's get into what you're doing right now. I know you have the book, but if we broke down exactly what you did on a daily basis right now, I've put you in front of a bunch of third graders at Career Day. One of the kids is curious and is like, hey, what do you do for a living? How do you answer that child?
Well, there's a couple of things I do. Well, I'm of counsel with the firm. We have 44 attorneys, and I'm in the criminal section. So I'm referring my cases from my practice. I had a practice for many years. I was an attorney for 35 years, combined between being a prosecutor and defense attorney. I was a prosecutor for about 8 years, and I left the office in 1997. I was the head of sex crimes and child abuse and vehicular homicide cases. And then I went into a small family firm. I was there as a partner for a couple of years. And then I started my own practice. And I had my own practice up until last December, and I closed it. Then I became of counsel with the firm that I'm with right now. And I'm assigned to criminal, but I'm not really actively taking on cases. So writing the book and promoting the book is something that I do. I'm teaching a class at Seton Hall Law School right now. We have another day or so of class. I've been involved in that in the last couple of weeks. So I'm just really doing some different things right now, law related, but, not practicing law where I'm taking on active cases and going to court.
So talk to me a little bit about the book. Talk to me about, how the idea came about, how you put this together, and how good it felt to get to the point where you saw this actually published and ready for people to consume.
Yeah, there was a lot of factors that came into writing the book. A lot of it was where I was at that point in my career. I always said that I didn't want to grow old being a lawyer. I wanted to have another chapter in my life. I saw so many attorneys that would just do it forever until the day they drop dead. And I was like, that's just not what I want to do. I don't find that's not rewarding to me. I feel like there's a whole life that has to be lived, and I don't want to do that. So, I started to think about that, especially during the time of COVID, when I was representing a lot of people that were accused of crimes. I mean, my criminal practice seemed to have taken off at that time. And I had about 7 people that were in custody and incarcerated at that time. And it became very difficult and challenging to get them out. But so I started to, I guess, put my frustrations into writing. I started to write about the cases that I was handling and the difficulties that I was having. And, I would say that the book was really the product of a lot of years of people just saying, Jim, tell me about the case you're handling. What interesting cases are you doing? And, I became like a storyteller, at the dinner table. When my wife and I would go out to dinner with another couple, they'd say, tell us about some of the cases you're handling. And, and I would think, wow, it really is a fascinating case. I'm involved in it, so I'm not really thinking like somebody else. So, I started thinking, that's a book to be written. And everyone said, you should write a book, Jim. You should write a book. That really is amazing, that story. And I'd say, you know what? That really is a pretty amazing story. I never really thought of it. And so it was like a compilation of all of that from both sides of the counsel table, being a prosecutor and being a defense attorney, and kind of capturing, those cases that I handled, from both sides. And then I started to think about it globally, the book, and I started to think about the nuances and the changes as a result of COVID. And I was like, the system has kind of changed. It's not really fair. And then I came up with the idea of unequal justice. And, everybody's idea is, hey, I want my day in court. I want to get in front of a judge. And I used to often tell clients, be careful what you wish for. That may not go the way you think. It doesn't always go as people plan. And then, of course, the subtitle for the book is the search for truth to balance the scales, because Lady Justice is blindfolded and holding the scales of justice. And that's a very visual image that people have. And the scales are equally balanced. And I didn't find that to be the case. I found that the scales were unfairly weighted for the prosecution.
So take me back to that question I asked you about being in the 3rd grade. When you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up? What was your ultimate dream?
I wanted to be a lawyer from an early age, probably high school on. Maybe because I had a family member that was an attorney. Maybe just a fascination with law. And, I'm trying to think of the shows that were on at that time. I don't want to say it was like Ironside or anything like that. Harry Mason, something along those lines, But I just had a fascination with law. I always was fascinated with history and, the creation of our country from its inception from English common law. And part and parcel of that history is really the development of our legal system. So I kind of became a scholar of that. That was something I studied in college as well, was the development of our common law system and the evolution into our system of justice that we have now.
So talk to me a little bit about, your childhood. What were some of the seeds that were planted into you that eventually became this career that you have in law? What were the things that were planted in you?
Well, geez, that's tough to answer, but, you think back as a child, like maybe, having to be an advocate for someone or argue for someone, that's being bullied, let's say, for instance, and standing up for them and realizing that you've got to get that point out and defend somebody. Maybe it's not physical, maybe it's just verbally, maybe making an argument for someone that isn't capable of maybe articulating the argument and putting into words what needs to be said. So I kind of, that happened a bunch of times as a kid, but I just felt like I was always the underdog, as a kid, in sports and things like that. I always had to work harder, try harder, put more time in. It wasn't like I was this gifted athlete, but eventually I developed the skills in whatever sport it was, whether it was baseball or football or basketball. And I think that was part of it, that whole idea of having to work to excel and to achieve. I mean, that could be applied in any walk of life. That's why I think sports are so valuable as, in upbringing, because it was really an important part of my upbringing.
So do you remember one of the early cases in the very beginning that you felt like this was your calling? This is what you need to be doing with your life. Did you ever have a moment like that?
Well, actually, it was my first jury trial, which is really the chapter in the book. It's called The Babysitters from Hell. It came about, I was a young prosecutor, and I really wanted to get into a courtroom, and I really wanted to try jury trials. I really was anxious to do that. I felt like that was what I was in the prosecutor's office to do, was to get that experience, to get in front of the jury and try cases. And at the time, the supervisor of the sex crimes unit was out on maternity leave, and I was really like itching to take a case. And I said, I got to get a case. And I had talked to her, and she said, I have this case. It's really, really complicated. It involves these babysitters and their cousin that were sexually abusing these kids they were babysitting over a period of time, and it's really a complicated case, and I really don't want to do the case because you're going to have to spend a lot of time with these kids to prepare them to testify. On the other side, the defendants or the accused in the case, the babysitters, there was a husband and wife, and they were somewhat related to the kids, like maybe like second or third aunt, somehow related. And and then the cousin that was involved in it had developmental disabilities, and he was mentally retarded. And I was like, well, you know what? If I'm going to cut my teeth, this is probably a good one to do it on. So I spent a lot of time preparing the case for trial, and ultimately went to trial, and all of the individuals were convicted. And it really became like a law school class, like all the issues that you talk about or you study in evidence came up in this case. Because I got the cousin to cooperate. We offered a deal to the cousin to cooperate and testify against, he was actually related to the aunt and uncle. And he decided he wanted to recant on the stand. And we recorded his statement where he said that they were part of sexually abusing and how it went down, how this went on for quite a period of time. And then when he got on the stand to testify, he decided he wanted to change his mind. He didn't want to testify. He didn't care about the deal he was going to get. And it really complicated things quite a bit, but we were able to, and I had to argue some issues of evidence to get that recording in where he gave a statement. And ultimately they were convicted. But I found that case was like so complicated, and I was like, I got through it. It was really my first jury trial. That's something to be said, because nobody in the office wanted to handle the case. She was basically offering it to anyone, and we had, I think, about 24, 25 prosecutors. And I stood up and said, you know what, I want to do that case. And I think that was emblematic of my attitude. As a young prosecutor, I really just wanted to get experience and get in the courtroom. But that case was symbolic in a lot of ways, because it was a tremendous victory.
So, you're dealing with heavy stuff with all of these cases throughout your career. I mean, things that no one could ever imagine that humanity would be capable of, and you are assailed by that all the time. How did you find that balance between having this job that you had to deal with heavy things with humanity, but to preserve your sanity and to evolve as a human being yourself? How did you do that?
Yeah, that's a great question because, it was hard at times. And I think it actually became harder later on in life as you get more years, and you have less years in front of you than you have behind you, you know what I mean? So I think I just kind of sanitized myself. Like I said, as a prosecutor, it was a little bit easy because it was like I have a job to enforce the law and do justice, and my job isn't about getting into personalizing the situations. Although it was very difficult, I have to say, representing the state, you obviously come in contact with crime victims a lot, almost, in just about every case. There are no victimless crimes. So it was difficult to do that, but you kind of have to, I don't want to say put blinders on, but that was kind of a little bit like you had to desensitize yourself, take the emotional aspect out of it. And then as a criminal defense attorney, I always looked at it as, look, everybody gets their day in court and everybody is entitled to their constitutional rights and everybody's presumed to be innocent. So, that was kind of like a subchapter of my book because people would often say, like, how can you represent people that are accused of such horrible things or guilty? They'd say that are guilty of these terrible things. And I'd say, well, they're not guilty. They're not guilty unless and until they plead guilty or they're found guilty by a jury. I said, or a judge says they're guilty in a bench trial. I said, it's very different. I said, so everybody's accused of a crime is not necessarily guilty of a crime. I said, so, there are people that are wrongfully accused of crimes that are in the wrong place in the wrong time. And I certainly have experienced that. So as a defense attorney, I think it became a little bit more about the system, whereas I guess it was the system on both sides, both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, but more so, it was more, I think it had more meaning as a defense attorney because, that presumption of innocence, and when people come to you and say, hey, I need good representation, I need an attorney that's going to fight for me, that's where it was. You were that guy. And, we have a lot of attorneys in the state. There are not a lot of criminal defense attorneys. And then if you narrow that down into the people that have the passion and the fight in them, it's even smaller. I found that in my experience, that there were very few criminal defense attorneys that actually were willing to go into a courtroom and do battle, as on behalf of somebody. So talk to me a little bit about who's been kind of that role model or hero for you that's allowed you to have this energy to persist and to be at the top of your game throughout your career. Oh, geez, if it was a legal figure, I don't know. I really, as much as I studied the law, I try not to be tainted or jaded by any one individual's views. I read a lot of law books over the years, just read them, not legal books where, you're studying, like treatises where you're in law school and you're reading a law book on constitutional law or criminal law, but, books outside of law, like a John Grisham book or a Scott Turow book, something like that. So I don't know that there was any one individual that, exemplified that passion or that fight or that drive. I would say hearing stories, not necessarily being a part of the trial or witnessing it or experiencing it, but, people over the years. I remember John Gotti's attorney, Bruce Cutler. I remember his presence in a courtroom, and I remember him being interviewed. He was a guy that I thought was a fighter, and there were a couple of people like that along the way. I was actually on Court TV a couple of times, and one of the guys on the show, and I wish I could remember his name, my gosh, God, he worked with Harvey Weinstein. God, why can't I remember his name? I'll remember it. Geez, I can see him. He had long hair. He was a defense attorney. And for a lot of years, he was a public defender, and then he became a private defense attorney. But I looked at the way they fought cases for their clients, and they really, looked at the evidence and evaluated the evidence and found that there were problems with the prosecution's case. And I was like, wow, that's really what a good defense attorney has to do, is really study what the prosecutor's next move is going to be and be prepared for that in advance. So I can't say there was like any one individual, but those are some names that kind of come to mind.
So, the one thing about, popular media and even Hollywood is that, the top shows on TV is law, police, firefighting, those kinds of things. And there's this perception that the public has when you're not on the inside. But I'm curious, from what you've seen and you've experienced, to kind of get to the heart and marrow of who you are and what you've experienced in your life. After all of these years of seeing these things that human beings are capable of, are you still hopeful for humanity? Where is your gauge on being hopeful about who people are and what they can do?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of good out there. I always look at, I try to look at the glass as being, half full versus half empty, and keeping that kind of point of view. It's hard at times when you see things going on, especially when they happen in the system. If the system's not treating someone fairly and there's injustices in the system, it really, I think it kind of elevates in terms of humanity. You see those because those are publicized. We had a case, I don't know how familiar you are, it may have gotten some national attention, but in New York, there was a guy that intervened at the subway. He was in the Marines. His name was Daniel Penny, and he killed a guy in a chokehold. A guy that was had a long history of arrests and convictions. He was in the subway threatening people to kill them, and this guy intervened, and we would say he was a good Samaritan. He stepped up. Everybody was frightened to death of this guy who was deranged. He was psychotic, and this guy, Daniel Penny, stepped up, and, he was holding him down until the police came, and the guy eventually died. This psychotic individual who had a long history with the law. And the prosecutor, the DA of Bragg in Manhattan, actually went after him and tried him. He was tried in front of a jury for the homicide, for the killing of this psychotic person. And here he was doing a good deed, really trying to protect those people on the subway. And I was like, this is really a miscarriage of justice. This is not right. Thankfully, he was acquitted. And I was looking at what was going on. It became a political point, this case. I don't know why it had politics attached to it, because I didn't look at it politically at all. I just said, hey, this guy is a good guy. And, if your wife or your daughter were on that subway train, you would want somebody like that on there with them, and I was really incensed that the prosecutor would actually go after this guy and put him on trial for this crime. And then to have the court be a part of it, to be complicit in it, there was a lot of things that were done that were wrong in that trial. I was following it. And maybe that goes back to my days being on Court TV and being a TV legal analyst. I did that for a lot of years. But I was watching it with a very critical eye, like the system. How is the system, first of all, why is this guy on trial? And how is the system, the criminal justice system, treating this guy? And I was like, it's not treating him fairly at all. There were a lot of rulings in the case that I thought that should have gone his way. Thankfully, it all worked out. I mean, I thought there was only one verdict that could be had, which was he was not guilty, and thankfully that was the verdict. But these are the things. I do think that there there's good in humanity. Like that was an example of good in humanity, of somebody actually stepping up in this situation where something really bad could have happened. So there are good people out there. I just, I hope the system can evolve and change. And I feel like there are opportunities for it to happen, but it's become a political pawn a lot. You know, I feel like there's a lot of arguments that are being made that people are looking at it with a very critical eye as to what goes on in the courtroom and arguing that it's political. And it probably shouldn't be that way. And I don't know. I hope there's hope in the future for that, but I don't know that I see that. I see people wrongfully accused being convicted. I'm actually reading a John Grisham book right now, which someone had, Jack Canfield, the author of Chicken Soup for the Soul, had actually suggested the book to me. I did an interview with him. And he said, "Have you read the book? It's pretty new." And I said, "No, I didn't." I said, "I know John Grisham writes a lot of fiction." He said, "No, this is a nonfiction book. This is about real cases." He said, you may want to take a look at this. He wrote this book with another guy. It's about 10 cases of people that were wrongfully accused, convicted, sentenced, and some of them were actually on death row. And through the efforts of either Project Innocence, which is run by Barry Scheck in Manhattan. I don't know how active he is anymore in it, but years ago he was very active with the DNA evidence and all that to exonerate people. But Grisham wrote this book, and I'm probably about halfway through the book, and it's modern day times. Some of the cases are from 90s, 2000, and it's still going on today. So I'm hopeful that there will be changes. I see a lot more rules regarding prosecution's conduct where they have to turn over exculpatory evidence. I mean, that's been in place for quite a long time, but I think they're being held to that a lot. The standards are getting tougher. It all comes down to judging, too. If you have a judge that's partial to the prosecution, it's going to be difficult. And that happens, unfortunately. It's very hard to take that. And judges are supposed to be neutral, unbiased and detached. And unfortunately, it's hard for them to do that, I think.
So of all of these things that you've done and accomplished in your life and your career, what are you ultimately the proudest of?
Well, I wrote actually a chapter in the book where I represented crime victims when I went into defense work. After I left the prosecutor's office, I became involved in a foundation, the New Jersey Crime Victim Law Center, and it was established by a gentleman by the name of Rich Pompilio. He's actually the only name in the entire book. I didn't name anyone in the book. They were either judges or prosecutor, defense attorney, accused, defendant. I didn't use any individuals' names. But Rich his son was murdered, and he started a victims' rights movement in New Jersey. And he was instrumental in having the crime victim amendment where they had constitutional rights under the New Jersey Constitution. I think that had a lot of impact on me, and I did represent a lot of crime victims in my years after the prosecutor's office. And some of them are memorable cases, where I represented a homicide victim's mother trying to get compensation from the state of New Jersey through a fund to pay for her son's funeral. I represented a family that they were one of many victims in a case that lived in an apartment complex, and they were being robbed by police officers that were rogue police officers in Newark. And they were going in and they were stealing their personal effects and belongings, and these people didn't have a lot. I actually negotiated a victim witness agreement for them to move from the state to testify and to leave the state and to take on aliases and have an allowance in another state. I did many cases like that, but those are two very memorable ones. Then one case in particular, when I was a prosecutor, I was pretty much at the end of my prosecution career. I had prosecuted a vehicular homicide case where a drunk driver had killed a mother And his conduct was so egregious. I mean, his driving conduct, in addition to his drinking, his level of alcohol. The laws in New Jersey at that time in 1993 or 94 were that under the traditional death by auto laws that existed, someone could get a maximum of 270 days in jail if they had no prior criminal history. And it would be 270 days county jail or 270 days of community service. When I explained all this to the husband, the victim, the deceased victim's husband, he was outraged. He said, somebody like that needs to go to prison. They need to go to jail for, state prison, not county jail. And I said, look, I'm only one person. The legislators write the laws. They change the laws. So to his credit, he went throughout the state and he petitioned citizens throughout the state, and 77,000 people signed a petition. He presented it to our local legislators, and they changed the law in New Jersey. So now that if you kill someone while driving recklessly or drunk and you're charged with vehicular homicide, you face a mandatory minimum sentence of 3 years in state prison. So you no longer have the ability to have county jail. And that was one person that, changed the laws. I said, wow, that's the power of one individual, just like Rich Pompilio getting the Victims' Rights Amendment passed. So that was another reason to write the book. I was like in these places, I was in these situations. I'm like, not every attorney has these experiences. I felt that I was in rather unique situations and cases, and I felt like maybe I was put there for a reason. And so that was something. And so as a result of that case, Bill, he started this foundation on behalf of his wife. It was called the Promise Foundation, named in her honor. And his role was to speak to high school students about the dangers of drinking and driving and drugs and alcohol. When you become a driver or passenger in a vehicle and make that decision, you need to know and be aware. And he started doing speaking presentations to high schools throughout the state of New Jersey. And he did a lot of that. And the crazy irony is he was killed himself. He was hit by a car while he was jogging. So I left the prosecutor's office at that time, right after his death. I left the prosecutor's office and I took his role on the board, and I did the public speaking. So I spoke to about 77,000 high school students over a period of about 2 years.
Wow, that's an amazing story. So at the end of the day, everyone has a perception of you: family, friends, clients, colleagues, everyone that gets your book, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Oh, geez. I never really stopped and thought about it. I just like to think of myself as a good person, whether I was a good prosecutor, a good defense attorney, fair, honest, have integrity, and stand for something. And that's always what I think is most important with anyone, really, is that they stand for their beliefs. They can support their beliefs, and, there's justification to believe the way they believe and to support those positions and have integrity, behind their actions and their words. I think that that's valuable. And to give back in some way, to help out, in some ways, our fellow man, fellow woman, in some ways that are less fortunate. Because I feel very blessed to be where I am. The situation I'm in and how things evolved. And, we had 25 prosecutors in the office when I was there. I guess anybody could have been handling these cases, but it was me, and that's kind of, I look back on that and I say, there was a reason for that, I think, and that was also the genesis for the book too, is to write about those experiences because I thought they were rather unique. And those stories were unique, and there's one after another I could tell you, and they really became the subject of the book. I wrote a chapter, and I felt like if I wrote these chapters, and gave them interesting titles, they would be interesting reads, and that's what I did. And there's one chapter called The Killing of MM and Death by Prison, and it was a case where a young lady was coming out of a health club and she was accosted by a guy in a hood. He was wearing a hood, and it was dark at night, and he came behind her and he sexually assaulted her and robbed her. And the case was all based on circumstantial evidence to convict this homeless person who was living in a van in the woods near this health club. And it really was amazing how the police put this case together and how we ultimately convicted this guy who was, and I don't want to say an interesting character, but he was certainly had some issues to deal with. And the victim in the case was a young, attractive woman. And I don't think she ever got over this incident. She became a heroin addict, and ultimately she overdosed. And this guy that went to prison, he was sentenced to 60 years, 30 years without parole, which was like an unheard of sentence. The judge gave him half of the sentence without parole, and it was taken up on appeal. And the appeals, the panel of judges that reviewed the case said that the sentence was excessive, so they sent it back to the judge. So he modified the sentence to 40 years in state prison, 20 years without parole. And within a matter of 6 months, the guy was killed in prison.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So if anyone out there wants to delve into all of these stories that you put in your book, Unequal Justice, A Search for Truth to Balance the Scales, where's the best place to pick it up? Or if they want to reach out to you, any of the good business in your world, where can they go?
Well, the book is available on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com. I have a website that I've created, unequal-justice.com. They can find me simply by Googling my name. There's some YouTube clips also, the interview I discussed with Jack Canfield, the author of Chicken Soup for the Soul. That's on YouTube. Right now my job is about, talking about the book and promoting the book. And, I'm writing another book. It's totally unrelated to law. But that's in the works right now. I kind of, I like writing and getting the stories out there. And, right now I've had the book critiqued a bit, and I was never really a writer. I mean, a legal writer, yes, writing legal briefs, but I never really wrote. And from what I've heard from the people that have reviewed the book, that have read it, said it's a pretty interesting, good read. So maybe there's a career there somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. James, this has been fascinating. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your time. Best of luck on the book and everything else, and have a great 2025.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. And you too. My very best to you in 2025.
Thanks for tuning in to another famous interview with Joe Dimino, where we cover the world of art, literature, business, spirituality, music, and more from around the globe. Our esteemed theme music was composed and produced by the great E.E. Pointer of Kansas City's River Cow Orchestra. If you want to hear more interviews, visit the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino channel on YouTube. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.